Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rita McGrath, and I'm here with Amy Webb, and it's our Friday Fireside Chat. And just a couple of housekeeping things as we get rolling. First of all, this is being recorded, so as I like to say, don't say anything or type anything that you wouldn't want your mother to see. And we'll be making the recording available later for those who couldn't be here live. And we'll also cut it up into little pieces so that those who can't sit through a whole hour can gather bits and pieces. Amy, who I'll introduce in just a second, we're going to spend about half an hour talking about what do we see coming in the future, and what should we be thinking about as we think about that. And then I think perhaps a half an hour talking about how do we bring organizations along with us, and what do we think about in terms of strategy and organization, having figured out what future we're trying to prepare for. So Amy, by way of kicking off, I thought perhaps if you could just give a little bit of your background and what does a quantitative futurist do anyway. That might be really helpful.
Sure. So hi everybody, Amy Webb. Longtime listener, fan of Rita's, first time webinar participant.
Likewise.
So I am thrilled to be here with you. So my job is not to make predictions. My academic background is game theory and economics. And so there are certainly times when you have a limited set of variables and good quantitative data that you can make predictions. So like a short-term financial, process involves, predictions. But when you are dealing with multiple inputs from different areas, and a lot of change, the goal is no longer to make predictions, it's to make connections. And really the job of a futurist is not about predictions, it's about preparation. So now that being said, the quantitative piece of it is, at least in my case, super important. So the work that I do is technology-led, it is data-driven, and it ranges at the beginning from very broad inquiries into emerging signals and longitudinal trends, which is, we track things that aren't trendy. We track change over longer periods of time. And that information we use to model plausible next order outcomes. And the whole purpose of this is to try to understand future states for organizations. And at that point, we hand over the work to people who know what to do with it.
So I'm just, in light of that, I have my exhibit A here, The Big Nine, which is Amy's most recent book. And if you don't have it, you should get it. It's really eye-opening, in which you lay out a bunch of different possible scenarios around the commercialization of AI, for example. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to mention any of the sort of ideas in the book that you think are particularly important, especially now that, we're not worried about AI right now. All we're thinking about is virus,
right? Well, I guess maybe I should also just mention that all of my work, so I'm the CEO of something called the Future Today Institute, which I founded 16 years ago. Wow. And my colleagues and I, obviously do this work for large companies, but we give away all of our research and have made all of our tools and frameworks free and open source. So the second book that I wrote was called The Signals Are Talking, and that really explains the front end of our methodology. The Big Nine is a deep exploration into the future of artificial intelligence and explains the history of AI and the sort of bifurcated track that we're on, pitting the United States against China. This is the book came out a while ago, so the story is one that people have now heard a lot. But the questions that I was concerned about have more to do with the global supply of food, redefining warfare in economic terms, not just, what happens when walking, talking robots come and murder us in our sleep, because a lot of people think about AI in a more anthropomorphized form. So, and the book has three different chapters that are scenarios: an optimistic, a neutral, and a catastrophic framing. In my world, optimistic does not necessarily mean sunshine and rainbows. It means, given the evidence and the data that we have, we made the best possible decisions. And unfortunately, I just heard from a reporter at a very large newspaper who sent me a message a couple days ago and said that catastrophic scenario looks uncomfortably prescient.
Well, I was thinking the same thing. So one of the, just for those that don't know, the catastrophic scenario is a global competition for resources, which basically results in something very like a virus being sent to exterminate us all, or those that aren't on the right side of that. And
we should just be cautious to say, we don't think that, I don't think you think this either, that China intentionally created and deployed a virus. Right. Yeah.
No, but I mean, I think when you, regardless of the source, right, the outcome is kind of what we're living through right now. And I think that's very interesting when you, to tie it back to your comment about preparedness. So it didn't happen the way you suggested it possibly could, but the consequences are very similar to what you suggested they could have been. So I think that's a very interesting, to me, kind of, there's an old phrase from systems theory called equifinality, right? So you can end up at the same spot many different ways.
That's right. Yeah. I don't know that. I'm going to write that down. What was that?
Equifinality.
Okay. Oh, it's finality.
It's the word from systems theory, which basically says, you don't have to understand the detailed behavior of a system to understand where it got to. There's many different ways to get there.
Yeah.
Which I think has always been my PhD is actually in systems theory, believe it or not. And so that was a phrase that we were very much struggling with back then. So what is it people? Well, so two questions. One is, you talk about 11 forces that you track over time and that you can't leave out any of them to do a really comprehensive job, and then take that through to how do you now construct scenarios based on those. And I remember once seeing your wall, which had all these connections.
I've got it. I have a little, I can show it to you if anybody wants to actually. So I'm in my, let me turn off, I can't reach it. Look, there's a light that's gonna, cause I, fill light. So I'm in my home office. I will spin this around. I have a giant whiteboard. There's George Michael. So here is, and again, apologies for this huge bright light, but that is my whiteboard in my office. And that's me working out connections between signal data. And sometimes that work is done heuristically. Sometimes it's done using regression. But again, the point is, if you're thinking about the future of anything, and so a lot of people right now want to know, what is the future? What is the future of a post-COVID-19 world, or in a new COVID-19 world? The math doesn't work out. So there is no the future. I think the reason people are asking that question is because they're uncomfortable with a soul-crushing amount of uncertainty. So the trick here is to remember that our individual experiences don't necessarily mirror everybody else's experiences. And also, a lot of times when we project out into the future, we are completely hampered by cognitive bias. And so most people, when they think about the future, imagine now, but more, which is why you're hearing a lot of these speculations that will just zoom forever, or that I don't know how many times I've been asked, or told, there won't be conferences anymore. Conferences are over. Festivals are over. Business travel is over. And as a futurist, my favorite question to ask people is, what would it take for X to be Y? Right? So what would it take for that to be true? Because a lot of times people jump ahead to the end of a scenario before having laid the data-driven foundation to get there. So, in this case, these 11 sources of macro sources of change are pretty useful as a framework. But again, it's just a reminder that the inclination is to take the signal data that we have today and jump with that only into the future. And whether you're an individual or a business, that thinking winds up being so narrow that you miss all of the external factors and inputs.
Well, and what happens, I think, is people project one thing, into the future,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they don't look at the system around it. So my favorite example of this is from 1963, the Jetsons. Meet George Jetson, right? And so they had flying cars, they had robots, they had animated attendants, and yet George and his wife and their two kids were like firmly rooted in 1963 America. And I thought that was fascinating. All this technology's changed around them, and yet all the other things that would go with that really didn't.
The Jetsons are a wonderful lens through which to think about the future, but not just because of the technology. Now, obviously, I focus on tech, but so do you know when how many seasons of the Jetsons were aired and when?
I know 1963 was, I think, when it started, and probably a couple of years, I would think.
Yeah. So here's what because I sort of I was very curious as to why our rubric for progress was the flying car.
Right.
Again, like of all the things that we are judging ourselves against, why a flying car? And also, has anybody been to Miami? Nothing against the citizens of Miami, but y'all are horrible drivers. And I don't know that I want that on the ground, like above me overhead. So here's what I learned. What I learned was that the Jetsons only aired one season. So there were a limited number of episodes. It aired at night. Yep. It aired at night. It was not a children's cartoon. It was like the predecessor of The Simpsons. So it was an adult cartoon. And that concept of a flying car that we saw told, it was told so well in the Jetsons, actually predates the Jetsons by 60 years. Because the first patent for a flying car was filed in 1917.
I did not know that.
And it was filed by a guy in New Jersey. And obviously that car, and it was just a car with like wings stuck on it. So that thing never took off. But it tells us something about the way that we think about innovation and what happens with innovation cycles, because every single decade since 1917, so for the past more than 100 years, there have been a flurry of patents for flying cars that all got filed at around the same time. And starting in the 40s, they actually built the cars and tried to get them to fly. So
Really?
There are hilarious images all around the internet that are, some of them might be Photoshop, but the originals, they crashed and burned, but they got these things up, for a couple of minutes and back down. All the way to the sort of not so secret project that the founders of Google were working on, and a few others. And now in the year 2020, Miami, the city of Miami, has built flying car parking lots on tops of buildings. So again, but this is, to me, this is such a fascinating and wonderful way to think about our shortcomings. Because it's fascinating to me that we reference a cartoon that is 60 years old, almost 60 years old, when thinking about the future. And if I say Jetsons car, I would hedge my bets that the majority of Americans know what I'm talking about, even if they've never seen an episode of the Jetsons.
That's probably true.
They were even alive when the Jetsons aired. So, but this is important because it really illustrates the problems of analogies and the problems of the cognitive bias creep, and how significantly a role it plays when we are trying to imagine next order outcomes, I mean. Yeah. From which you can derive income. So
maybe some of which. Well, what I think is interesting too about your work is how you put together really different, how you make connections between really different things. And we had a question about how do you get organizations to be more hyper aware? And that's something I wrestle with a lot because, from the innovation space that I tend to work in. And, everybody's so nose down, keep the wheels on the bus, don't bother me with this stuff, and yet when something happens, they all freak out, right? So any tips for hyper awareness?
We do a tremendous amount of work with, they tend to be very large, spread out organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Rita probably knows way more about this than I do, but when you're working with a distributed team, so if you're dealing with a matrix organization or a multinational organization and you've got a central hub, but the spokes are spread across many different offices, you start running into just sort of tactical challenges like getting everybody's schedule to align. And the challenge, and so what that I think enables is a tremendous sort of siloed effect.
Mm-hmm.
One of the smartest people I have ever known, and probably the best untrained futurist, is I met him when he was running the financial projections for a magazine at the very bottom rung of what used to be the Time Inc. empire. And I just remember, like, I would come in and have meetings with executives, and I always ran into this guy who was like, hey, do you have a couple of minutes? Can I ask you a question about, like, and then he would rattle off a whole bunch of things that I'd never heard of. And then he would have made the connections between those things and say, do you think that this means this opportunity or this risk? So he was doing a lot of this stuff naturally, and also was just like just devoured information. Now, here's the problem. You've got this tremendous resource in a division of the organization that was not answering up to strategy, which meant that when he didn't have a pipeline to send up that information. B, at the time, the organization, he would not have had credibility because of where he was placed. It just, that wasn't the group of, they were the spreadsheet jockeys. They weren't the innovation people or the futures people.
Oh, even the innovation people don't often have a pipeline to where they're going.
And that was an organization that was largely housed in one building in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about a big multinational or a big matrix organization, those problems become significantly more exacerbated. So the workaround that we've developed that I think works well is to put together a cross-functional team of people and agree to meet every couple weeks. And the 11 macro sources of change, which you can get to on the Future Today website, futuretodayinstitute.com is the website. Just like have everybody pick one of the sources. And it's better if you're not a subject area expert, just like pick one of those and then pick maybe two other adjacent areas that are interesting. It can be content, it could be the Internet of Things, supply chain, whatever. And like from now on, your job is to just pay more attention to those areas. And the act of doing that, read a little bit more, maybe create a Google News alert. It doesn't have to take you a ton of hours, but then you get together as a group every 2 weeks and you go around sharing information. I have found that sometimes if you don't have a framework or a sort of strategy for doing a meeting like that, dominant personalities take over. Totally. And, right. So we created, and this is also, you can get on the site for free. It's a strategic conversation guide that just, every person just goes through, they answer these couple of questions, and it's doing that, that will sort of organically start shaping those connections. And we've done this with several, again, huge corporations with teams that are spread out all over the place. And it's like a change overnight. It's a stupidly simple, thing to do. Now,
so many of these things aren't like super complicated or super difficult.
Right.
One of the companies that I really admire is the German metals company, Klockner. And one of the things they did, and again, this was super simple. Now, big old German company. So, hierarchy kind of is us. Yeah. And what their CEO did, though, he said he put in Yammer and he said it's non-hierarchical communication. Anybody in the company literally can contact him, can communicate with him, and he responds. Not to everything, not all the time, but he'll dip in there, and the fact that someone is listening means someone anywhere in the organization can, raise an issue. And it connects to something that, Amy Edmondson talks about a lot, which is you have to be willing to bring those things up. And I think one of the reasons organizations develop these blind spots is, the future can be uncomfortable. It's not like,
the other thing, yes. And the other piece of this is to sort of stop chasing certainty. So
that's a great
and
phrase.
I'd be curious to know if you have figured out a way to think this through. When we work on foresight projects, most organizations and teams are sort of structured. They are structured to have a beginning, middle, and an end, right? And when you're working on projects or growing your organization, there are so many different inputs. Beginning, middle, and end would assume, like, what happens when you get to the end? So thinking in terms of past, present, and future makes a little bit more sense, because the challenge is at some point you have to operationalize all of this work. Otherwise, it's just, sometimes more data doesn't lead to better outcomes. It's just more data, and more inputs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the question was, how do you get organizations to respond, not to think in that very narrow way? Well, I like to talk about discovery-driven learning, which is, so a couple of frame setting things. So, we're used to thinking of, I think, the present as the low uncertainty stage, right? So I'll just use my esteemed institution as an example. You have the Columbia Business School graduating class of 2020. And if you'd asked me a year ago, how much money would we make from that? Who was going to be a part of it? What was going to go on? I would have been able to tell you. You tell me about the Columbia graduating class of 2022. I do not know. The dean doesn't know. The president of the university doesn't know. So one of the things that is happening now is that we're all now shoved into this high uncertainty situations in every single aspect of what we're doing. So it's a bit of a crisis.
Yeah, I think the other one, when I hear you talk about case studies and companies that have done things well, it seems like another common thread is those leaders that are willing to lean into uncertainty and to think and act more incrementally are the ones that tend to weather a lot of the disruption, and also, I think, make more space for seeing around corners, for catalyzing that innovation. And I just bring that up because right now I see all of these executive teams seeking certainty, and it's a little bit like chasing the dragon.
Absolutely.
The more certainty, certainty is brittle. And if you stop and think about, again, I tend to go back to math and data a lot, but what would it take for your KPIs, for your metrics, for your idea, for your vision, to be exactly as you've stated it right now, X amount of time into the future? You would have to have like an omniscient view of all signals, all data, all information, and also be a supercomputer at the same time, and time would have had to stand still. So for those of you who watch or read The Watchmen, The Watchmen is my favorite graphic novel, you would be Dr. Manhattan, right? So that doesn't exist. So, but it takes a good, strong leader, I think, to be willing to be flexible. And flexibility isn't the same thing as being, you can be flexible and still be a very strong leader, but it's creating some of these pathways, I think.
Well, and I think what I've seen gifted leaders do is they create small pools of certainty where people can function. So here's an example. So I was working with a team that was innovating in an insurance company, and they were introducing this new product. And the thing about insurance in the US is it's regulated by state. So on the day of launch, you could have 1 state, 10 states, 50 states. You have no idea how many states are going to say, yes, it's okay, you can launch. So I'm watching this conversation between the head of operations, who's responsible for the launch, and the project manager, who's responsible for running the project. So the project manager is saying, are you ready? And the operations guy's like, well, I don't know, I think maybe if we do this and
Yeah.
do that. And are you ready to, and this conversation is going nowhere. So I
Yeah.
kind of pulled the project manager aside and I said, look, what you have to tell this guy is how many states he needs to be ready for. Like, you're putting him in an impossible situation. He can't answer the question. And the project manager says, well, I don't know how many states. And I said, well, neither does he. But, you're the one who's responsible for the thing. You can more easily take the flack if you're wrong than you can. So we walk back in the room, same conversation, project manager. And he said, well, what if I told you, I think it's 15 states on launch day. Snap change in the whole atmosphere. It was like, oh, 15. Okay, yeah, I can use these resources. I can do it. And if it's a little bit more, I can do this.
Yeah.
It completely cleared the air of all that uncertainty. So one of the things I think leaders really need to be thinking about, and Tom Kolditz, who's a really great essayist on leadership, used to teach leadership at West Point, aside from jumping out of airplanes and other fun things that he does. But he talks about creating this sort of calm within the case of the greater uncertainty and saying, I don't know, but for today, here's the most productive thing you can do.
Yeah.
Take this pencil and move it from here to there.
Right.
And when I know more, I'll get back to you. And so it's that blend, I think, between, trying to, create certainty when you really don't know yourself, but creating enough certainty that people don't just freeze. And I think that's one of the things that is very, very difficult for people to grasp.
I agree with you. And I think the antidote often is frameworks. So I am a very, very big believer in process and frameworks. And that is because, if an organization, so one solution to crushing uncertainty, which may hamper productivity or morale or anything else, is having a process. And if everybody just understands where they are in the process, or what the process to solve some of that uncertainty is, that tends to allow people to take greater risks in thinking about the future. I can give you an example.
That'd be great.
So there's a company that we worked with, huge matrix organization, multinational, that was really focused on heating and cooling and HVAC and compressors and things like that. And over time, it was a conglomerate. So as with many companies, they started out with a core competency, grew, and as they grew, they started adding on complementary divisions. And in this whole process was a company that makes golf carts. So it's kind of like a weird appendage, right? Stuck on to the rest of this enormous organization. Now, as the company, as every company does, how and where are we growing? What are we doing in the future? And the question that we get is, what is the future? What are the signals? What are the trends? What's the technology? How does all of this fit together? Where is there risk? Where is there opportunity? I kept coming back to this golf cart. Which nobody wanted to talk about. And the answer for me was because if we connect, so if we go back to those different sources of change, and if we start thinking through how does the landscape change, where do things connect? And so this is going back several years, but we were on the cusp of sense and avoid and self-guiding technology for drones, land or air-based, right? We were also at that, so that's more commonplace now, but back then it was still pretty novel. There's a lot of research being done in 4-dimensional printing. So 4D printing is like 3D printing with additives. So if there's a light or heat or air conditioning or something, the structure might change. So it could contract, expand. Anyhow, so we're putting together all of these different signals, spatial computing, live mapping. And I said, it strikes me that there's an opportunity here to invent refrigerated drone technology that could transport people, pets, and objects, but more likely food and medicines and other kinds of things like that, because you've already got the core competency in refrigeration and the cold chain. Some other company may have software.
That's a cool idea. That's a
right?
cool
Okay.
idea. Putting it together.
So all of that makes sense. But if you don't force yourself, that's you're not going to be able to make those connections without using frameworks. And the challenge for so many companies is that they get used to measuring the things that they have control of.
Right.
Your metrics will always make sense if you're only measuring all of the variables over which you have total control.
Totally.
So that's one way to get certainty.
Right.
You will always, get to the end of a product roadmap if you're making teeny tiny little incremental shifts and changes and a thing that you've already done and you've never really changed it. It's this other area where you can get ahead of risk and mitigate it, or you can create a market and a new opportunity. But that requires, frameworks, leaning into uncertainty, and just operating a little differently. Yeah.
Yeah. So on an earlier Fireside chat, we had David Kidder, who's the CEO of an innovation firm called Bionic, basically. And what he talks about is just having, dozens of really fast experiments to try to really figure out what the where the real opportunities are and what the customer truth kind of is. And one of the things I think is so hard in organizations is that, over time, right, you grow up with these metrics, you start to predict them, you start to know what they are. I mean, I'm very interested watching my own institution grapple with this issue. What is a university without a campus? What is a classroom without students in it? What are all these things? Yeah. And I think we're still so anchored by, this is what a classroom is, this is what, a conference is, this is what, or whatever. And it's very hard to sort of answer those kinds of questions with our current frame of reference. My guess is the answer is going to come from somewhere completely different. So I'm sure you're familiar with Innocentive. So this is a spin-off, for those of you that don't know, this is a spin-off from Eli Lilly. And basically what they do is they connect people who have problems and are willing to pay to get them solved with people who have technical expertise who could possibly be relevant to the solution of the problem. And they put a price tag on it, right? And what they have found time after time is that the solutions almost always come from a different area of expertise than those that pose the problem. So I wonder if you can comment on that at all.
Right. Well, again, I think I was just speaking with I can't tell you who it was. It was a government-funded lab.
Okay.
So speaking with them yesterday, and we were actually talking about the same question. And I think, in their case, these are the uppermost echelon of researchers in their area of science and technology. It's a sort of multifaceted problem that is not uniquely American. I think the problem begins in our education system. We are so hyper specialized that if you want to study whatever biology, you are studying what somebody a couple of years ago decided the future students needed to study today, because that's how the accreditation system works. What it does not do is anticipate what the workforce will demand in 10 years.
Exactly.
And so what's happened is, rather than going broad, we've gone hyper-specific and deep. And I think that there is definitely use case for that, but it's ignoring this other realm of thinker that we need. And that thinker is more hybrid based. So what happens is hyper-specification in education leads to hyper-specification in the workforce. And there are definitely times when you need the person who can do this type of quantum mechanics, but you also need people who are, sort of cross-trained in weird specialties. Like, it'd be amazing if we could convince universities around the world to start offering, dual degrees in biotechnology and geoeconomics, or, synthetic biology and home automation. The problem is we're not doing that. And so we wind up with incredibly smart, narrow thinkers. And that's what I think leads to these gaps in innovation. It sort of, everybody who complains that we don't have flying cars yet, well, yeah, no kidding. And it's also why, humans are sort of creatures of habit. We don't like change. So it takes a lot of additional energy for us to accept a new pattern. And actually, for everybody who's talking now about Zoom fatigue, like how hard is it to sit in front of a video camera and talk with somebody? We FaceTime all the time, right? The challenge is that our brains have to now process the data inputs in a very different way. Everybody's two-dimensional. We don't have the ambient data and information. You know, it's different, right? So I think that that's partially what's happening, but it'd be great if organizations, if companies, universities included, could continue to cultivate those subject matter experts, you know, because we need them, as well as truly cross-trained hybrid thinkers. They're both important.
One of the really interesting examples I've seen of a university doing something along those lines is Arizona State.
Oh, yeah.
And what they've done is they looked at their departmental structure and they said, this is, you know, bats. It's just crazy. And they actually gave their faculty the option of redesigning their divisional structure, which for those of you that don't work in academia, this is unheard of. Like if you're from accounting, you're always from accounting. If you're from, you know, physics, you're always physics. But what they've allowed their faculty to do now is create these sort of interest group structures around around whatever interests them. So, you know, they might have had 5 divisions working on, you know, adjacent problems, and now they can all kind of work together. They've also created a situation where as a faculty member, you can actually move from group to group. Like this never happens in university.
So how would you do that? So I'm going to interrupt you because
That's fine.
How would you make that work in a company? How could you
in a company?
Yeah. How could you replicate some of that?
Well, I think what you talked about earlier is anything that cuts across the silos, I think is really good. The other thing that there's actually some increasing evidence in support of this is LinkedIn did a study of people in organizations that became CEO. And because it's LinkedIn, you know, they have all the information about the jobs these people have held. And what they're increasingly finding is that narrow functional specialists hit a ceiling. There's just a place beyond which they do not go. And that the people that actually break through to decision-making roles have these really zigzag careers. So maybe they were in marketing and now they're in compliance. Maybe they were in compliance and now they're in, you know, operations. And that these seemingly sideways moves, I actually think it's sort of an unconscious survival instinct that causes boards to pick these people because they're exposed, right? They're exposed to a much wider range of inputs and ideas. And I think that's just super helpful. You know, there was a couple of questions about looking for leading indicators. What are some of the KPIs that we want to look for going in the future? So I'll start and maybe you can chip in. My current sort of gold standard example is Microsoft. And what Satya Nadella basically said to the company was, look, you know, we need to shift strategy and we also need to shift culture and we need to do it fast and we need to do it now and in a really big way. And one of the things that they talk about is in a cloud-based world, which is where Amazon's going, where Microsoft's going, the big predictor of success is going to be usage. So if people use our products, that will drive revenue and so forth later on. And so he said, before we can get usage, we have to get customer love. Can you imagine? And before we can have customer love, we have to have empathy for our customers. So here's Microsoft, my God, talking about empathy. And the thing I thought was so interesting was he took his whole senior team, and half of the metrics that govern their compensation are indeed the traditional ones, you know, revenues and sales and that kind of thing, which are all lagging indicators. The other half are what he calls power metrics. And these are forward-looking. So these are metrics related to the future of the company. So, you know, new ideas, customer usage, love, those kinds of things. And he's actually put those into their compensation plan. So, you know, to me, the way I think about this is if half your compensation is going to come from how well you're managing the future, you're going to be a lot more incented to manage the future very, very well.
That's right. And I think that's one of the challenges in strategic foresight. So, and that's sort of another way of describing the work of a futurist. The challenge with strategic foresight is that it's very difficult to calculate an ROI in advance. So you can, you know, on a particular work stream that results in a product or service, maybe, but a lot of times the work is, you know, sort of creating a data-driven idea of a plausible future state, and then backwards engineering it there are KPIs along the way, obviously, but a lot of companies are hesitant to take action on something for which you don't have every detail 10 years from now, because how could you? And they don't sort of know how to take that first step. I actually worked with Microsoft a couple of years ago. I did.
Well, maybe that's why they got so smart.
And I worked with them on AI as they were trying to sort out their current pathway. And, for a lot of organizations, there's a desire to quantify and prioritize actions. And sometimes that quantification can lead to a very rigid plan when in fact the opposite should be true. I mean, there needs to be some incentive built in for exploration, which doesn't mean frittering away time. It's just a slightly different approach. But again, it can be a little challenging. So as long as those metrics and KPIs for the future aren't also so rigid and determined by certainty, I think that's pretty good.
So on the metrics side, we were asking about how do you motivate organizations, and on the metrics side, something I talk about a lot is present value, which is Columbia graduating class of 2019, versus option value. And option value is the value of the right to make a future choice. And the future choice may be to continue, the future choice may be to stop, the future choice may be to do something entirely different. But the way that we measure option value is, what's the upside relative to the cost that you have to invest to possibly access that upside. And when you put it in those terms, I find business leaders get a lot more comfortable with making a highly uncertain investment. So let me give a couple of examples. There was a shipping company, and one of the frustrations they have is they take all these shipping containers from China and they take them to the US, and then there's nothing to do with them, right? Because we're not exporting back to China. So they end up having to bring them back to where they were going, and it's very expensive. So one of the solutions possibly was you had collapsible shipping containers made out of a recyclable material, which when they got to the US, you sort of melted this stuff down, and you could then take like 100 containers and put them into one. And so your cost of going back and forth was much, much less. Now, does it work? Can we do it? Who knows? But if you look at the cost of that process, relative to what it would be worth to you if you actually could discover a solution, I think when people start looking at those kinds of variables, it starts to be much more practical and doable. And they're like, well, okay, I'm not going to spend $5 million on this project, but I will spend $50,000 to figure out if this is even feasible.
That is the place where I see so many companies getting stuck. Is to me, that is, I am always in favor of small bets and incremental actions, as I know you are too. Sometimes it's not just a matter of CapEx or whatever, small investments, it's time. And convincing an executive team to make room for a small pilot or a small test, knowing that the end result of that might be, we're not going to do it, but we learned, and now we recalibrate and continue to move forward. It can be a very difficult sell. But it's, I think, the smartest way. I mean, the companies that I think are weathering a lot of disruption, even in a pre-COVID world, are those that are willing to make those kinds of bets.
Absolutely. One of my favorite examples is Nike, that, began experimenting with direct-to-consumer channels in the 80s, right? And made a lot of small incremental investments in that, beginning with this sort of Nike Probe, I think it was called. I forget. It was like the early version of the Nike Pod, but it was way before the technology was available. But they kind of kept at it. They changed their pattern, but they really looked at the solution. So what are the things that make for a great kind of client utilization of what you do? Like, what are the ingredients that make it really worthwhile for them and fun for you to sort of help them?
That's a good question. We are, so my team and I work intentionally across different industry sectors and with different types of companies. However, there are a few bits of connective tissue that unify everybody. It's not enough to want to work on the future of something, the future of artificial intelligence as it relates to retail or,
I get that all the time. Yeah, absolutely.
that's not enough. The team, we sort of require a cross-functional team. And because foresight work should really not only be in the domain of business insights or consumer behavior or strategy. It really should be a horizontal function across the organization and preferably at an executive level. So we require a cross-functional team. We also, I believe very strongly in experiential learning. So part of what we do always involves us transferring our knowledge back to the client because we want them to continue doing this work. Again, it's, foresight does not have a beginning, middle, and end. It has a past, present, and future. And that means the work has got to be ongoing. And not every, so we are always interested in building institutional capacity whenever possible. But there are companies that are more interested for a variety of reasons on the signal side of things. So, where are their signals? What are the longitudinal trends? And that's what they need. There are companies that want that plus a calculation of the trajectory because they're trying to do a long range plan or a strategic planning process or whatever. There are companies that want plausible next order impacts and outcomes. So what's the future? What are the potential futures? What might they look like? And so that's in the realm of scenarios. So we sort of take projects up to the point at which they become, they have to be implemented. And then we hand them over to people like you. for mothership control.
Mothership management. Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That I think over the years that's become one of my specialties. We call it mothership management, right? Which is managing the relationship between the organization as it is and what it could be in the future, and that's often quite an interesting challenge. I think so just some ingredients on that, that where I would start, right? So you want to start with, who are the stakeholders? Who has power in the organization? What are their interests? And where are the sort of alignments between the different interests? One of the things I think that has come out of my work on strategic inflection points is something that echoes what you said earlier, which is that very often these weak signals of change begin at the edges. They're out there somewhere where they're not being paid attention to by the powers that be. One of the most wonderful historic cases I've ever used at the business school is called Gunfire at Sea, and it's about a person that discovered what they call it, floating platform gunfire. So before you had this, you had fixed guns on the ship, but the guns were basically useless because the ship rolled, right?
Oh yeah.
And so ship battle at sea was the navigator's job, right? Because the navigators would get close enough to the enemy's ship, and then you'd throw grappling hooks over, and then it was like hand-to-hand combat, and it was pretty gory and miserable, and there was kind of no place to go. And that was sea warfare for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this guy basically invented putting the guns on a platform which accommodated the role of the ocean. But he was like this lower level, irritating colonel out in the middle of the South Asia seas. Everybody hated him. He was a real squawker, And it wasn't until he finally got the ear of Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, who said, a 4,000% increase in performance. I want that, and I want it now. But it was a fascinating case because the data were there, absolutely clear. The effectiveness was there. But if you think about it in the context of the Navy, all of a sudden, the gunners are going to get an attitude, right? It's like, they were like second-class citizens before. And now the navigators are going to get told, look, get me close enough that I can see the enemy and go take a nap, have a cup of tea. It's our battle now. So it totally destabilizes the power dynamic. And that's often what you find when you run into these innovation kind of battles, which is really fun. So we've got about 10 minutes left. anything you want to ask me or anything we should
Anything?
delve into more?
Yeah. Yeah. So one question that I get a lot is, and it sort of relates exactly to what, where you just left off. Sometimes preparing an organization for the future requires a cultural shift that can be difficult to manage when you have very strong leaders who have a wonderful track record of success. So what do you do in an organization that has never, that has never had to feel that sense of urgency because they've never been smacked with a disruptive event? And yet there is a high probability disruptive event on the horizon, or a collection of, a constellation of signals that would indicate change. How do you sort of inculcate within the executive team and the rest of the organization a mindset that change doesn't mean throwing out the success that we've had,
Right.
but rather preparing for the success that can come?
Right.
What do you do?
So I have a couple of techniques that I use, and let me run through three of them. First, very simply, and it's a really simple change formula that I use a lot, which was actually invented by Michael Beer. I didn't even invent it, but it's really useful, which is three things you have to have if you want to make an organization change. So the first is there has to be constructive dissatisfaction with the current state. So there's got to be some answer to the question, why change, right? And the more vivid, the more real, the more personal you can make it, the better. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Then you have to have some idea of where you want to go. So to me, that's the strategic part, which is your vision, if you will, or your strategy. And that may not be written out in like granular detail, but if I were to take the example of Dyson, the people that make these high-end vacuum cleaners and stuff, and their strategy has always been kind of, if it blows or sucks or uses batteries, it's sort of in strategic context. And if we can get 30% margins, we'll consider working on it, right? So pretty clear, like the specifics of what we're doing are very varied, right? So they're in everything from electric cars to vacuum cleaners and hair dryers and God knows what. But within that broad spectrum, there's a lot of stuff they won't do. They probably won't make refrigerators. Dissatisfaction, some kind of vision for the future state, and then you have to really think about what's the process that I'm going to use to remove obstacles between where I am and where I need to get to. And the power of those forces needs to be stronger than the forces of resistance lined up against it. So there's a couple of things you can do, right? You can amplify your DVP, and you can make resisting more expensive. And so,
wait, I'm going to interrupt. How do you do that? How do you make? Because that's fascinating. So how do you make resisting more expensive? I love that.
Lots of techniques. So a couple that you can make are you find out who in power is in favor of X, whatever it is you want to do. It's different. And you can, so let me take this at a slightly different time. I have a sort of a sliding scale for this. So the first question is, can you co-opt them? Right. That's cheap, right? If you could common enemy, right?
Yeah.
Right. I'm Microsoft, you're Apple. We really don't like each other very much, but we both hate Google so much. We will team up, so common enemy. That's a great source of co-optation. Second sort of tranche, and I do, these are sort of an increasing order of risk. So second is, can you buy them off? Now, buying them off means you're going to have to give up something: timing, resources, money, currency, whatever. So if you can't do that and you can't buy them off, can you perhaps isolate them from the situation, right? So can you get them to sort of, they play in their swim lanes, you play in ours, and we just mutually agree not to interfere with each other. And if you can't do any of those things, maybe you need to bring in outside help. So that's riskier. You're appealing to some superior authority or outside body or making things visible. It's interesting. I think politically we're seeing this now as, and it's manifest in the form of whistleblowers and people that are trying, and it's risky, right? I mean, you run a risk if you do that. So I think there's a sort of a very careful way you can think about making resistance more expensive to the people that are resisting the change.
I love that. I think that is, I've never heard it articulated in that way. And I was taking notes. Okay. I'm taking notes. This whole entire thing is very beneficial for me. It's great. I love that.
Back to the dissatisfaction though. And I think this gets to the power of stories and the way that human beings respond. Like, as you know, I mean, you can be as right as you like. You can have the best data in the world. doesn't swell a human heart, but stories do. So with the dissatisfaction part, I've done things like I've had people write a newsletter from the future. We've had groups break up into, destroy my business on the one hand and try to defend my business on the other, and then bring them together. Another technique I use is something I call brand takeover. And I have this from my friends Greg Galley and Mike Byrne. And that's like, you wake up one morning, congratulations, your company's just been bought by Amazon, let's say. What would they tell you to stop doing that you're currently working on? What would they tell you to start doing that you're not working on? And if they increased or decreased your budget for marketing, say by 10 million, what would you do differently? And somehow the thought that now I'm not working for, XYZ Acme Corporation and I'm now working for Amazon, it frees people up. It opens their imagination. Right. So I think there's really constructive ways you can start to get people to be more receptive to change. The other thing that I think I do a lot is let's master a small change. Let's do something. So I'll go back to Klockner, my German metals company, with digital. And they didn't start with, guns blazing, we're going to digitize, we're going to, no, they said, a lot of people in our supply chain send us faxes to order supplies because our offices are closed. Why don't we make an app that replaces the fax? So from the customer's point of view, that was a lot more convenient, but it didn't perturb the organization at all. And then it was, well, now that we've got online orders that are possible, maybe what we should do is, update the parts inventory and make that online. And so what you saw was a gradual kind of incursion of digital into their business without causing the business to have to be totally upended, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting to me about what they did, the platform is called something X. I'm trying to remember.
XOM. XOM.
Yep. To me, what was fascinating about it is it also potentially could have been seen as cannibalizing their existing parts of their existing business.
It did. Oh, it totally did.
Within an industry that has been very reluctant to change. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that we encourage people to think about time is not using a linear process, because that just marks milestones. The shape that we use is an angle, a cone. The further out into the future you go, the wider that angle becomes, because it assumes less certainty and evidence. However, the decision-making process and goal at that point is to imagine a systems level evolution. So to me, it's a very good example of working the near and far end of the cone at the same time. We call it a time cone. Imagining the future evolution for the industry, and then defining in the present what the tactics and strategies are, versus having an upstart come in from the outside, define that future for them, and then drag them into it. Right?
Exactly.
So it's a wonderful case study.
Yeah, it really is good. So I want to make sure our listeners know where to find your resources, because they are amazing and wonderful and free, which is what could be better than that. So it's thefuturetodayinstitute.com.
So it's without the. So it's futuretodayinstitute.com. And we have a newsletter. We have a community foresight tool. We've got a ton of stuff you can download. We've got a searchable database of all of our research that we have made public. One-stop shopping for strategic foresight.
I love that. I love it. You're going to get a neon sign, right, with that?
Yeah, blinking. Very bright.
So I want to thank you so much. This has just been, as I knew it would be, just wonderful. And to be continued. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.